is our brief claim for this session. In ethical considerations, we as human beings require reason, rationality, and the ideal of fairness as our minimum requirements. So just a brief run through of our outline for the session. Start with our introduction and recognition of some capacities as human beings. The second one is a brief introduction to reason, rationality, reasonableness. The third one is on impartiality and fairness. And the fourth one, what does it mean to have or to require minimum requirements for ethical considerations? The fifth one would have to be our other considerations or some harm that these requirements might involve with the other groups in our society. So for the first one, we have our capacity for reason, our capacity for compassion, and our capacity for judgment. Now, I think it is important to recognize that as human beings, we are given, or at least we have the rational capacity for reason and understanding. That means that we are capable of thinking, we are capable of willing, and that we are capable for judging or for judgment. This is not only capacities that we use in our everyday lives, but this also includes our decisions and choices for the future and our judgments in our history as human beings. Our capacity for reason is not only the capacity that we as sentient beings have, we also have the capacity for compassion and the capacity for judgment. So before we go to the capacity for compassion, we might want to look into where compassion is coming from, where reason is coming from, and where this judgment facility comes from. Since I am a Kantian scholar, my epistemic background would have to be Kantian philosophy and Kantian transcendental philosophy in his critical tradition. So we recognize that it's important for us as human beings not only to have and to employ our capacity for thinking, but it's also a responsibility for us to ensure that we cultivate this capacity for reason. And this means that we have standards for the rightness and wrongness, not only for our actions, but of course, again, for our thinking capacities and for our logical considerations. Our capacity for compassion, I think, would have to stem from the depth and breadth of how we are able to imagine ourselves as the other person, or in Filipino philosophy, kung paano natin makikita or maisa sa buhay ang buhay ng ating kapwa, o kung paano natin nakikita ang ating mga karanasan hindi lamang mula sa ating mga loob o mula sa ating mga isip o mula sa ating mga mata, kundi pati na din mula sa mga kalooban ng ating mga kapwa. We are not saying that we have the capacity to absolutely occupy the understanding, the minds, and the perspectives of our fellow human beings. What we are saying here is that we have a capacity to imagine what it's like to be the other person. And we take that as an important aspect in our ethical considerations, given that we can only live our lives as ourselves, and thus for us to be able to empathize and for us to be able to sympathize with our other fellow human beings or other sentient beings or other beings that occupy the world, it's important for us to imagine what might be the experience from the points of view of these beings. Now, for the third part, the capacity for judgment, I think it's important to note that the capacity for judgment is important not only in deliberations but also in making decisions. We might want to refer Aristotle here in his Nicomachean Ethics when he wrote or when he said in his lectures that it is important for us to arrive at a decision, and that decision is buoyed by deliberation. Deliberations is our space wherein which we are able to reason with one another or present reason for one another. Nevertheless, for Aristotle, it is important that these deliberations end so that we may now continue to act. For the deliberations to end, we are required to decide so that that decision would provide us a product or would propel us into action. So the decision, in a way, is a form of judgment which we are now capable of arriving at because we have been using our capacity for reason. Again, it is important to understand that we have been loosely using the term judgment or judging in different situations or in everyday situations. But what we are trying to point out and clarify here is that for us to be able to decide properly, for us to be able to assess a situation properly, if it is an ethical dilemma, if it requires unethical action, we have to make sure that it is not only our thinking and willing capacity, our capacity for providing reasons, our capacity for feeling for other persons, but we are also required for our capacity to judge and assess properly what's needed, not only in particular situations, but also with an understanding that these decisions and these judgments can take the form of a rule or a universal law which may guide future generations after our own lifetimes. Now, the second one, why is it important for us to talk about reason, rationality, and reasonableness? We could not hide the fact that we share in the interactions of our publics, and that we also share not only our ideals and actions and engagements, but also our skills and our hopes within the discourse of the public good, for us to be able to make sense not only with other fellow beings that we share this world with or that we share the public space with, but for us to also make sense with ourselves, it is important for us to consider not only our capacity for reason and rationality, which we have discussed earlier, but also take the ideal of reasonableness. So, what does this mean? Reasonableness, well, in a way, is our capacity to communicate our reasons to the other person and also to assess and understand what the others are, their reasons, their experiences, their point of views, for us to be able to enter into deliberation. We understand that not all considerations can be rational, or we can say that there are certain ethical considerations or deliberations that come from an emotional source or from an intuitive source. Since we are only discussing the minimal requirements for ethical consideration here, what we are saying as well is that we might also want to um, relate our concepts of reason with the concepts of that we find in emotions, so that we do not alienate or we do not marginalize reasons, feelings, sentiments, and emotions and life worlds that our other fellows bring into the table when we are doing deliberations or when we are doing ethical considerations. This does not necessarily have to happen in public spaces. This can happen in our personal relationships, in our homes, in our classrooms, in our everyday pakikisalamuha with our kapwa. So it is important for us to see that through our reason, we do not dictate what the other should think, what the other should feel, but because we have reason, and under that is our capacity again for imagination, then we are made capable of seeing how values, how interests, how desires vary across different beings, and that as part of this the experience or the history of humanity, we have to understand that reason is not a dictator, it's not authoritative, but we appeal also to the ideal or to the concept or to the rule of reasonableness, so that we do not bring harm to another person, nor do we fall into violence when we're trying to do conflict resolutions, for example. The next one is the other part of our discussion for this day on impartiality and fairness. There are, I think, ideals that we follow as human beings. So this could be the values of truth telling, the values of our family, the values of our desires and hopes and dreams. But when we are trying to contextualize our discussion on public spaces, public spheres, for example, or in our professional lives, or even in nation building and democratic practices, it is important for us at least to have working values or working frameworks on how we might be reasonable and how we might be able to arrive at a decision or to arrive at an intervention on particular activities and particular actions, but also with universal effects, not only on our lifetimes, but on future generations. So, one ideal that we are trying to discuss in the session is that of impartiality and fairness. And I think we are assuming here a stance of justice. So when we're trying to decide, when we're trying to arrive at reasons, when we're trying to think not only in ethical considerations, but in everyday situations and our relations with our friends or families, our colleagues, our government officials, we ask ourselves, okay, are my frame of thinking, are my thoughts or my sentiments fair? Fair to myself, fair to the other person, fair to the public, fair to a universal point of view. We ask ourselves if our decisions that we are trying to arrive at will impact not only ourselves, but also, again, the other person, the public good. We also look into how our reasons and even the idea of reasonableness is fair, not only to us who might have been practicing our rationality, but also to other groups wherein rationality might not necessarily be a value and might not necessarily be a requirement for their own capacity for judgment. I Before I go into why is it important for us to discuss minimum requirements for ethical considerations, I would also like to point out that not all sentient human beings or not all human beings are same in their thought processes and their thinking capacities. We also have to understand that we have different approaches and we lead very different lives, and we are also given with different body capacities. So we have differently abled fellows. We also share the world with animals. We also share the world with other objects. We also share the world with nature. We have the trees, we have even at the level of the bacteria and the level of the atoms. We have to understand that when we're trying to invoke the ideal of impartiality and fairness, we might also have to include the other beings that we share this world with. I think having this ideal and having this reflection and insight, we not only expand our judging capacity, but it also adds to our understanding of how we are rooted in this particular world and how we live this world together with other beings. So the reason, the rationality, and the practice of reasonableness, I think, has to take the stance of impartiality and fairness. And again, this has to include the experiences of beings that are not necessarily human and that are not necessarily sentient, so that we could arrive, well, at a working understanding of what is considered as the good or what might be considered as ethical in the general and universal sense. Now, the question goes the next question would have to be, why is it important for us to discuss minimum requirements for ethical considerations? Again, of course, we are limited by our human capacities and human understanding and how we relate to our world and other beings in the world. Nevertheless, for us to be able to work with one another, for us to be able to reason with one another, for us to be able to live with one another, to make this world a home, it is important for us at least to reach for minimum requirements on how we might want to process and how we might want to interact with one another and how we will be able to build our nations and communities equitably and justly. And because we are looking solely for minimum requirements, which for this session is that of reason and rationality and that of the idea of fairness and impartiality, we might also want to consider, we might want to research further on these considerations so that we understand that our decisions, our judgments aren't harmful to everyone that is involved. So as we have mentioned earlier, we might want to consider or we might want to extend our ethical considerations to other beings, and this would have to include beings that are non-human, non-sentient. The other things we have to look into our vulnerable sectors in society, so that would have to be the differently abled, the groups of society is actively marginalized based on their gender, their expression of sexuality, their expression or their belief in a particular religion and their expressions of spirituality. We might also want to look into progress in animal sentience and learning, and of course, the recent topic or theme on machine learning and artificial intelligence. I would just like to point out, and I would just like to end this session with a hope that we may not want to fear things that are new or things that we do not understand. I think our responsibilities as rational agents in the world is not only to invoke the ideal again of impartiality and fairness, but also to extend our imaginations and to extend our considerations to things that are strange to us. And that would have to include new phenomena, new species in the animal kingdom, new forms of thinking, new ways of expression, new ways of life, so that we do not become imprisoned by our own rationality. And I think Weber was the one who theorized and who wrote about the irrationality of rationality. I think it is important for us to cultivate our rational capacities so that we see that we can do more and we have the capacities to do more. And lastly, I hope that we also understand that with our rational capacity comes as well the responsibility to accept and make criticisms and critique, not only to our actions, but also of the actions of others in our communities, in other communities, and in the whole participants of our world and nature.